Greetings, Melindy's spider tattoos, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
It's our 50th episode, so excuse us if we get a little self-indulgent for a moment. A little over 5 years ago, we uploaded the very first Codex Compliant episode on the incredibly short Codex Assassins from 40k's 3rd edition. The episode was a bite-sized thing in itself. Just 6 minutes? Really? Amateurs. And wasn't perfect, but it did prove the concept and went down pretty well. Well enough that it led to us continuing the series and it becoming the main thing we do. As this is our 50th proper episode, the corrections videos don't count. Because we say so, we thought it would be nice to tie this video back to that very first one. So to that end, let's take a look at the 2nd edition version of Codex Assassins.
And we know the cover is the same Wayne England art that they used for 3rd edition. They just do that sometimes. Released towards the end of 2nd edition in 1997, and written by Ian Pickstock and Andy Chambers, this 24-page codex was twice the length of its 3rd edition iteration. As you would expect, it didn't contain the rules for a full faction, but instead for the main 4 different types of Imperial assassins, of which you could take one in any army who was able to take Imperial agents as part of your support allowance, which, unlike in 3rd, did include the Dark Angels, just in case you were wondering.
It should be noted that, although this is the first Codex Assassins, Imperial Assassins have been around since the original 40k rulebook in 1987, with some models released in 1989, along with rules in 2nd edition's Codex Imperialis from 1993, although those were all for generic assassins rather than for specific temples. They were still highly trained, augmented killers, but were more just a single, very skilled character that could be specced out with whatever gear you wanted. This did mean you could make assassins that would have some of the flavour of the temples we know and love, but you could also make assassins in power armour that wielded shotguns. Which would, admittedly, probably be quite effective, but it lacks finesse. Saying that, specific assassin temples had been knocking around for a while, with the Callidus temple being given particular attention by Ian Watson's incredibly normal stories containing the character Melindy. Individual temples would also get entries in White Dwarf during 2nd edition too, expanding them from the simple generic rules. For example, the aforementioned Callidus would be laid out in issue 190 from October 1995, but Codex Assassins was where it was all brought together in one place for the first time. So let's take a gander, shall we?
First of all, you'll notice that this codex has a lot more background fluff than the 3rd edition version, giving you a much more complete understanding of the faction right out of the gate. The Assassinorum is an organisation secret to nearly everyone, and whose deployment is sanctioned only by the High Lords of Terror themselves. The assassins it wields go through rigorous training and enhancement from youth to become living weapons, and very few survive that training. The rest of the introductory segment is dedicated to the Wars of Vindication, a period just after the Age of Apostasy where the assassins went to war with each other in the Imperial Palace, with the Grand Master of the Assassins faking his own death in a way that involved not 1, but 2 fake bodies, all because of outside manipulation of a rivalry for the position of Grand Master, and a copious amount of shape-shifting callidus assassins. The whole thing led to massive reorganisation of the Officio Assassinorum, with the Inquisitor Jaeger recommending the official records on the events be amended to read:
In the anarchic Wars of Vindication, the Grand Master himself fell to the Assassin's Knife. Thereafter, the High Lords took special care to control the Officio Assassinorum so that, in theory, only traitors and heretics need fear it today.
As the reality was, frankly, far more embarrassing for all concerned. Which is cool because that's the exact wording used in the earlier fluff to summarise this period. An explicit reminder that the lore dumps in codices aren't neutrally written and can be taken as in-universe propaganda. Also an interesting note, even though there are only rules for the 4 main temples in here, the poison specialising Venenum temple is name-dropped, who would eventually show up in a playable fashion in the Horus Heresy game.
Although they cost different amounts, all types of assassin shared the same basic stat line and came with a handful of rules that applied to all of them. These were mostly just establishing that they were incredibly hard to kill and were immune to a lot of things, from toxin gas to feeling the emotion of fear. They could also infiltrate, which makes a lot of sense since, well, they're assassins. Getting onto the actual temples, we start with the Vindicare Temple. Vindicare assassins specialise in vengeance and revenge killings, practising callous, unfeeling destruction which eliminates their targets with contemptuous ease. Or to put it another way, they're the ones that shoot good. Combining their sniping skills with an emphasis on stealth and evasion, the Vindicare assassins are commonly used to put down rebellious politicians and revolutionary leaders who have the gall to suggest that maybe the Imperium could stand to be a little bit less bad sometimes. Such heresies have often been halted by a single shot from a Vindicare's Exitus long rifle.
In-game, the Vindicare was a good enough shot that there were no restrictions on which model he could fire at as long as they were in line of sight, such as being able to pick specific characters in a unit, as well as do things like selecting which bit of a vehicle he'd hit if he shot at one, because when you shot at a vehicle in second, you could hit different parts resulting in different effects. Like, it was possible to shoot a track off a Land Raider so hard it did a front flip and squashed anybody it landed on. A Vindicare's fancy paired rifles and pistols could fire special ammo, with each ammo type able to be fired once per game. These were the Shield Breaker that could destroy force fields, the Turbo Penetrator, which had a -6 saving throw modifier and did double damage, and Hellfire, which always wounded living targets on a 2+, but did nothing to demons since, well, they're not really alive in the traditional sense. We're also a fan of this little quote attributed to Vindicare Temple training dogma. 3 things matter in marksmanship: location, location, location.
The Callidus Temple was up next, whose assassins specialise in the use of the drug polymorphine that allows them to rearrange their bodies to resemble other people, enabling them to get close to their targets without them ever knowing. Through special implants, it is even possible for a trained Callidus assassin to take the form of the alien enemies of the Imperium, even Genestealer hybrids. On the battlefield, they use this skill to take the place of enemy soldiers, allowing them to get close to commanders, influencing their strategy before striking them down. And, since this is 2nd edition and they did whatever the hell they wanted, this was actually represented in how they played.
As well as being agile and hard to hit even for an assassin, instead of being deployed normally, the player controlling the assassin could instead select a basic enemy trooper model with some restrictions and have them secretly be their assassin, to be revealed to their opponent at the time of their choosing. Which is admittedly a very fun and fluffy rule, although I know for a fact if I ever used it I'd immediately forget who I picked until the squad they were in were gunned down. For weaponry, they had poisoned blades, a neural shredder, a gun that used a flamer template that made enemies take a leadership test that would cause a wound if it failed, and finally, a Catan phase sword, which is interesting since it had that name even in the 1995 White Dwarf printing of these rules, which does illustrate how the name Catan was thrown around for a while before the Necrons showed up. They were even name-dropped in Codex Imperialis right at the start of 2nd edition, although they lacked the apostrophe back then.
Then came the Eversor Temple, whose assassins were used when you needed someone killed and weren't too fussy about how much mess they made. Eversor assassins are shock troops primarily used against rebel governors, gutting a command structure with such unrestrained violence that no one dare take their place. Or, at the very least, everyone would be too busy cleaning viscera off the ceiling that nobody actually had the time to rebel anymore. To do this, Eversors are hopped up on so many combat drugs, bioenhancement, toxins, and psycho-conditioning that they need to be kept in cryostasis when not in use, and are running so hot that upon death they are unable to keep that volatile chemistry in check, and so just explode. So always drama with that boy.
In-game, they were the most expensive of the assassin variants. 240 points was the equivalent of 8 basic Space Marines if you were curious, and were designed to be a beast in combat, from their weapon skill getting better the more people are trying to stab them in a given combat, to spilling poisonous blood on anyone who is actually able to land a hit, to their neuro gauntlet that kills people in a, and I quote, excruciatingly painful and violent manner. Actually, the neuro gauntlet was pretty wild if a model was wounded by it but not killed. The potent cocktail of acids and toxins would half its stats for the rest of the game. Bit excessive if you ask me. They also have a selection of combat drugs they could take each turn to make them either super speedy, allow them to fight past death, or just never stop fighting in general. And of course, he explodes upon death with the strength of a plasma grenade. They're a lot, and they were even allowed to fire their pistol an amount of times equal to their attack stat. Each turn, even on Overwatch. Finally, we had the Calexis Temple. Their assassins are made from pariahs, people with a rare mutation that means they have no presence in the warp, making even those with no sensitivity to such things uncomfortable around them. In secret, many of these pariahs were sent to the edge of the galaxy beyond the reach of the Astronomicon, where the Calexis Temple calls home. There, their abilities are enhanced, allowing them to slip through the battle lines unnoticed and unleash powerful negative psychic energy, something particularly dangerous and upsetting to enemy psykers.
In-game, Calexis assassins were a nightmare for psykers. They were only targetable by psychic powers, or indeed any other warp-based weaponry, if the Calexis player rolled a 1 on a d6, and their very presence could wound a psyker who tried to cast a power too close to one. The Calexis' force matrix gained charges from nearby psykers, which could be unleashed as blasts from their animus speculum, that's the big thing strapped to their head, and when aimed at psykers it could even destroy a power of theirs for the rest of the game. They could even permanently drain the stats of a psyker if they got into melee combat with them. And even if you weren't a wielder of warp-based magics, they were still incredibly hard to hit, as their general abomination-iness meant that it was easy for an enemy's subconscious to just pretend they weren't there. So if they were targeted, they got to roll a d6, and on a 2+, they successfully managed to remain unnoticed, and the enemy must target another unit. Although the assassin would lose this ability once they were wounded. Which, since they're two separate rules, I guess that technically means they'd have to roll 2 consecutive 1s if they were shot with a warp-based weapon like, say, a D-cannon, for it to even have a chance of actually hurting the Calexis. That's a 1 in 36 chance of the scatter roll even mattering. Maybe don't fire at a Calexis with a D-cannon. In 1997.
And there we go, that's the 2nd edition version of Codex Assassins. This codex would not remain relevant for long, as in the following year, 1998, the 3rd edition of 40k would be released, which rendered all previous codices, including this one, obsolete. And with the release of the 3rd edition Codex Assassins in 1999, it meant that the Assassins got 3 entirely different sets of rules published in as many years. Which we in the business call a bit much. Since this glut of rules, the Assassins have settled into a less frantic position, having their rules printed wherever was convenient at the time, sometimes as part of a larger codex like in 5th edition where they showed up in the Grey Knights Codex, and sometimes just in a free PDF like just recently. They've even had a whole board game based around them in 2015 with Assassinorum Execution Force. Although, in general, they tend not to be the focus like that very often. They tend to keep a low profile, which is fitting, I suppose.
And as for this series, well, over the last 50 episodes, I think we've proven 3 things. That Games Workshop will always take the most confusing route possible, that Gavthorpe really has written a lot for them, and that I don't think we even know how to write a 6-minute long episode anymore. So, as the grimdark future gets ever closer to being the grimdark present, we'd just like to thank you for supporting this silly little series, and for clicking on videos about subjects that you definitely didn't care about beforehand, but hopefully did just a little bit after you'd watched.
And here's to another 50 episodes of talking about little plastic blokes hitting each other with chainsaws.
Hello my friends, thank you for watching. If this video has tickled your fancy, then please let us know by leaving a comment, giving us a like, or, if I may be so bold, by giving us a sub if you haven't already. If you'd like to support what we do, we have a Patreon that helps pay for things like the electricity with which to power the fridge freezer that we put miniatures in, and means that your name can join those kind souls who are scrolling past right now. As this is the 50th episode, I do just want to take a moment to thank not only all of you for supporting whatever this nonsense is, but also to all the people who agreed to do little cameos in these videos like Rem did in this one. It really means a lot that people give up their time to help us out, so, you know, cheers folks. Anyway, see you next time.